Everyone assumes an Afro-Trinidadian family tree runs in one direction, back across the Atlantic, straight to Africa, on a single ship, at a single point in history. For a striking number of Trinidadian families, that's not actually where the trail leads first. It leads to another Caribbean island. Historians traced exactly which one shows up most often in the documented record, and the answer explains something about Trinidad's population that a simple, straight Africa-to-Trinidad story completely misses. Here's the piece of Trinidad's history that almost never makes it into ancestry conversations. Trinidad's slave-based plantation economy started late, in the 1780s and 90s, and stayed relatively small compared to giants like Jamaica or Barbados, which had been running massive sugar economies for over a century by that point. But after emancipation in 1834, and especially after oil was discovered on the island in 1910, Trinidad's economy took off in a way almost no other Caribbean islands did at the time. Cocoa production expanded rapidly through the late 1800s. Oil and gas expanded even faster after 1910. Both industries needed workers at a scale Trinidad's own existing population couldn't fully supply. And Trinidad didn't get most of those additional workers from Africa, because by then, the transatlantic slave trade itself had been abolished for decades. It got them from its neighbors. Over the following century, thousands of people from smaller, poorer islands, Barbados, Grenada, St. Vincent, Antigua, Dominica, St. Lucia, migrated to Trinidad, chasing wages and opportunity that their home islands, with smaller economies and fewer industries, simply couldn't offer. Which means a huge number of Afro-Trinidadian family trees don't run in one straight line back to a slave ship from Africa. They run first to another Caribbean island, sometimes only 1 or 2 generations back, and only then further back to Africa from there. By the end of this video, you'll know which island shows up most often at that crucial first stop, and why. Historians studying Trinidad's population records have documented this migration in real detail, and one pattern stands out immediately. It split cleanly along language and religious lines, inherited directly from which European power had colonized each migrant's home island generations earlier. Immigrants from Barbados, St. Vincent, and Antigua came from islands that had been under continuous British Protestant control. They arrived already speaking English, already familiar with British colonial institutions, already positioned to move directly into the kind of jobs the colonial administration valued. Immigrants from Grenada, St. Lucia, and Dominica, by contrast, came from islands with deep French colonial roots, and arrived speaking French-based patois instead, even though those islands had already come under British rule by the time this migration was happening. That language divide mattered enormously for how each group's descendants integrated into Trinidad's society. English-speaking migrants, and Barbadians in particular, moved more easily into skilled colonial-era positions: the civil service, mechanical trades, policing, teaching, because they could operate immediately in the language British administrators required for those roles. Barbadian migrants settled in specific, well-documented communities, including a long, nearly continuous stretch of villages running between St. Joseph and Arima, where they worked as artisans, mechanics, and shoemakers. Colonial-era observers specifically singled them out, describing them as more energetic and harder working than the island's existing Creole population. A characterization historians have since noted says as much about who was writing the records as it does about the migrants themselves. Grenadian and Vincentian migrants followed a different, though no less significant, path. Many settled in and around the same industrial zones, driving Trinidad's cocoa and later oil economy, work that was physically demanding and didn't require the same fluency in formal English that civil service positions did. Their numbers were substantial, but the historical record documenting exactly where they settled and what specific trades they entered is considerably thinner than the record for Barbadian migrants, in large part because so much of the surviving colonial-era commentary was written in English, about English-speaking communities, by English-speaking administrators. So, when you ask which island shows up most distinctly and most consistently across the documented record of Afro-Caribbean internal migration into Trinidad, Barbados stands out clearly. Not because Barbadians were the only group. Grenadians and Vincentians arrived in real, substantial numbers of their own, but because Barbadian migration into Trinidad is the most specifically documented connection of the group, tied to named communities, named occupations, and a clear, sustained settlement pattern that both colonial administrators at the time and historians afterward tracked in detail. That connection creates something genuinely unusual in Caribbean ancestry. A documented chain running Africa, to Barbados, to Trinidad, all inside the family history of people who today simply identify as Trinidadian, with no reason to assume there was ever a stop in between. The Bight of Biafra ancestry we already traced as Barbados's own strongest documented African connection in an earlier video in this series doesn't necessarily stay contained within families that still identify as Barbadian today. Through this later wave of internal Caribbean migration, a meaningful share of that same ancestry likely belongs to Afro-Trinidadian families as well, carried a second time, decades after the original transatlantic crossing that first brought it into the Caribbean. One honest note here, consistent with every video in this series. This pattern is drawn from real, detailed historical demographic research, documented community by community, occupation by occupation, cross-referenced against colonial records and later academic work by historians like Bridget Brereton. It is not yet backed by a large-scale genetic study specifically measuring, island by island, exactly what percentage of Afro-Trinidadian ancestry traces first to a neighboring Caribbean island rather than directly to Africa. Broader Caribbean genetic research has shown scientists can measure the age of ancestry using DNA segment length, the same method we've referenced in earlier videos in this series, and in principle, that method could be applied to test this exact migration pattern directly. As far as we've found, that specific study, testing Trinidad's population against Barbados, Grenada, and St. Vincent's populations directly, hasn't been carried out yet. One clarification worth making, because it comes up constantly in discussions of Trinidad's population. The term Coco Pagnol, sometimes confused with this Caribbean to Caribbean migration, actually refers to a completely different group. Spanish-speaking agricultural workers who migrated to Trinidad from Venezuela, not from other Caribbean islands, drawn by the same cocoa boom. It's a real and significant part of Trinidad's population history, but it's a separate migration story from the one this video is focused on. This matters for a bigger reason than just Trinidad's specific history. It complicates the entire premise. A lot of ancestry content, including some of our own earlier videos in this series, quietly rests on the assumption that a Caribbean nation's African ancestry traces cleanly back to a single transatlantic crossing, island by island, with no complications along the way. Trinidad shows that isn't always true. Sometimes the real journey has 3 stops instead of 2. Africa, to one island, to a second island, all inside a family history that most descendants assume only involves one crossing. It also means something for how we should read our own comment sections. Viewers describing Grenadian, Vincentian, or Barbadian roots inside an otherwise Trinidadian family aren't describing rare exceptions to a simpler rule. They're describing one of the most well-documented demographic patterns in the island's entire post-emancipation history, one that shaped entire neighborhoods and entire trades, not just a handful of individual families. If you're Afro-Trinidadian, There's a real chance the honest ancestry conversation in your family isn't just which part of Africa did we come from? It's which island did we come through first, and which part of Africa before that. Barbados is the most consistently documented answer to that first question in the historical record, but it's not the only true answer for every family, and your own specific path may run through Grenada, St. Vincent, or somewhere else in the region entirely, even if the written record for that particular route is thinner. That layered structure, Africa to one Caribbean island to another, isn't a complication that needs explaining away, and it isn't a lesser or less authentic version of ancestry than a single direct crossing. It's a more complete, more historically accurate version of the story than the simplified single crossing version most ancestry content, including a fair amount of what's out there right now, tends to tell by default. We've now shown that at least one Caribbean nation's population carries ancestry that passed through another island before it ever reached its final home. If you want us to trace this same kind of internal Caribbean migration for another nation, or go deeper into the specific Barbadian, Grenadian, or Vincentian communities that settled across Trinidad, tell us in the comments. And if uncovering the real, documented history hidden inside the African and Caribbean diaspora matters to you, subscribe, because that's exactly what this channel exists to do.